From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week, we turn our attention to the humanitarian disaster unfolding in the Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta. The area has been under rebel control since 2012, and this month, the Syrian regime and its Russian and Iranian backers have maintained a massive aerial assault that has killed hundreds. The UN Secretary General described the catastrophic scenes there as hell on earth. President Trump called it a humanitarian disgrace, and his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, has accused the regime of using chemical weapons. The regime, Russia, and Iran argue, on the other hand, that al-Qaeda-linked terrorists operate in the area. The UN Security Council passed a 30-day ceasefire resolution on Saturday after numerous Russian attempts to block it, but that seems to have had little effect on the ground. With me to discuss the situation in eastern Ghouta are MEI's two resident experts on Syria. First, Mr. Ibrahim al-Assil. Ibrahim is a fellow here at the Middle East Institute. He's Syrian. He was one of the early founders of the nonviolence movement in Syria and the Syrian opposition. Ibrahim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul.
And a regular guest, I dare say, on our show, Charles Lister, who is MEI's Director of Extremism and Counterterrorism Program and an expert on Syria for many years. Charles, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Ibrahim, let me start with you, and if you could sort of describe the humanitarian sort of situation. How many people are in this suburb? What has life been like up to the last couple of weeks, and what kind of hell is it like now?
So there are around 400,000 people in eastern Ghouta, and eastern Ghouta has been besieged since almost 2013. So we're talking about almost 5 years of besiege.
And the siege has been how tight? What is nothing getting in?
It depends on the time. So there are sometimes tunnels where people smuggle goods inside Ghouta. But of course, even when we're talking about the basics like sugar and rice, it's very, very expensive. And sometimes they are not available at all in the markets. Besides that, of course, the medical situation is awful, and only a very few and small number of schools that can still be operated. And in the last couple of weeks, things got even worse, exactly as you described it, as hell. Almost every day, around 100 people got killed through the aerial bombardment and the air campaign. It got a bit less violent in the last day or two when we're talking about the airstrikes, but the land assaults have continued. This morning, I asked a friend in Douma about the situation and if
Douma
it's
is in this
in eastern Ghouta,
yeah,
and if it's any better. And he said anything you could imagine is better than the last few days. So he said it's better, but it's not good at all. In the last few days, people didn't see the sun for like a week or so. Everybody
they were
moved to the basements. Exactly,
yeah.
They moved everything. So this is just to imagine the city. Nobody in the buildings. Everybody is underground, and wow. Even this is in the last couple of weeks. But even when we're talking about the last 4 to 5 years in eastern Ghouta, people can't move. Usually, they just move and live their life in 2 to 3 blocks in those areas, because also they are afraid of the airstrikes, and then also because it's under different opposition armed groups.
Different groups. We'll get
and
to
there
that
are checkpoints.
in a minute. Charles, let me ask you, why now the assault from the regime and the Russians are involved? Who's involved? Why now? The siege has been going on for many years. What changed to create this new assault?
Well, the short answer to the question is this is one component of the kind of post-ISIS reality. Obviously, ISIS still exists in some ways in Syria in multiple pockets, but more or less it's a defeated territorial force. And as far as the regime was concerned, it had mopped up those ISIS areas that it needed to mop up and that it was able to mop up. And East Ghouta was the obvious next target for them. East Ghouta was one of the first areas to rise up in opposition to the regime back in 2011. It's been, despite 5 years of siege, a kind of stalwart and stubborn adversary to the regime in the capital Damascus. Having liberated or conquered Aleppo last year, East Ghouta was the next obvious strategic area of importance for the regime. It seems fairly inevitable, unfortunately, that East Ghouta will eventually fall under regime control one way or another, and that will be a major strategic victory for the regime. It will have meant that it will have shored up its capital, it will have shored up the biggest city, Aleppo, it will have shored up the vast majority of what it calls useful Syria. What happens after that, who knows? But what we're watching right now is a well-practiced regime strategy of severe bombardment on besieged areas that always has ended up with one eventual conclusion, which is a mass surrender. Normally, when the civilian population essentially puts the armed groups under enough pressure as to consider an evacuation, and then the infamous green buses arrive and people get shipped off, mostly to Idlib in the northwest. Unfortunately, that seems to be an inevitable reality here. Is just a question of time. The Russians have demonstrated pretty clearly that they are 100% behind the regime in recapturing this area, which perhaps, at least in terms of some of the phases of the Aleppo operation, is actually a different dynamic. Russia appears very determined to take East Ghouta back along with the regime. And I think that tells us all what the eventual conclusion will be. And we've all seen how horrendous the violence has been. And as Ibrahim said, a daily death toll of nearly 100 people, and the average was over 90 people died every day for a week straight over the last week. That was the kind of number that we used to hear across all of Syria at the height of the civil crisis. So for all of that to be happening in one pocket of really. Damascus's suburbs is a huge amount of violence. And the amount of munitions and bombing it takes to kill that many people in one small area on a daily basis who are all hiding in basements. Is massive, and none of us should forget the significance of that. And then more broadly speaking, the extent to which the international community really has no leverage to stop this.
We'll get to that in a moment. Ibrahim, let me come back to you. Who are the armed groups that are in this? I mean, the civilians are going through hell, obviously, and maybe have been for a long time, and they're paying the heaviest price. Which are the groups that are operating in which parts of Eastern Ghouta?
So there are two main groups. The biggest one and the first one is Jaish al-Islam, and the other one is Falaq al-Rahman. And there has been some intra-fighting between them.
Well, tell us a bit about both for our listeners. So Jaish al-Islam, how would you describe it?
Jaish al-Islam, most of the fighters, they are from the area. They are from Ghouta. They are not foreigners. They are more to the Islamist side, ideologically speaking. However, I wouldn't describe them as jihadists at all. And they are connected to their community. They are from the community. They have committed many violations, for sure, against that community and against civil society activists there. However, the solution is absolutely not by just bombard the whole area. As,
and the other group...
and Falaq Rahman, which is kind of similar to Jaish al-Islam, but there is always that competition of who would control what in Ghouta and the tunnels. And there are other smaller groups, and when we talk about jihadists, there is a small number, around 180 to 200 foreign fighters. And
who are they with? I mean, under which group?
They fight independently, and sometimes they were also fighting against the local groups. And now the local groups, they want those foreign fighters to leave Ghouta, and that was part of the negotiations, because sometimes the regime doesn't open the ways for them to leave. They want them to stay.
Yeah. Does Islamic State or
no.
Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, have any presence in this area?
Not ISIS, but yes, some of the fighters are affiliated with al-Nusra group, and also sometimes they were fighting against those two armed opposition groups, between al-Nusra and Jaish al-Islam and Falaq al-Rahman. But whenever there are usually airstrikes, the priorities change on the ground, and people switch into survival mode. They just want to avoid the airstrikes.
Well, Charles, let me ask you, I mean, from the regime side and or the Russian and Iranian side, do they consider Jaish al-Islam and Falaq al-Rahman terrorist groups? Is that part of their narrative? Or do they say there are other groups that are there and that's kind of why we're shelling? How are they pitching this?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where you get into politics, and it becomes rather ambiguous. I mean, at substantial times on the diplomatic level, the Russian government has made a distinction between the Nusra affiliate groups and groups like Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham, who are probably the two bigger, most ardently Islamist, but not jihadist armed groups in Syria. And the Russians have quite consistently, on the diplomatic level, said these groups are not terrorist organizations because they acknowledge the importance of politics and diplomatic negotiations. But when it comes to military dynamics like in East Ghouta, suddenly the Russians pivot and say, no, Jaish al-Islam has occasionally in the past worked alongside Nusra, therefore it's a terrorist organization, and therefore what we're doing in East Ghouta is a counter-terrorism operation that the international community should embrace. So the Russians on their own have chipped and changed between their definitions. The Russians also maintain a constant dialogue with Jaish al-Islam with regards to the Astana negotiations, ceasefires, cessations of hostilities, etc., etc. So they play these two faces off. When it comes to the regime in Iran, they've always had a black and white lens. Any armed group that fights against the regime is perceived by the regime in Iran as a terrorist organization.
And how much, I mean, speaking of Iran and maybe its proxies, how much are they involved in this fight? I mean, we know of the Russian Air Force and the Syrian Air Force, right? They're the main ones involved in the aerial strikes. You did mention there was a land aspect to this. Are the Iranians and their proxies involved in this fight?
Not as significantly as they have been in Homs and Aleppo. Actually, the main armed forces on the ground on the regime side are the core loyalist remaining units of the Syrian army, which effectively now operate as militias, but the Tiger forces, led by Suhail Hassan, are the main pro-regime loyalist force on the ground, who have tried to launch a number of probing attacks on the ground in the last couple of days to test the opposition's defenses. They're the main ground force. The Russians have signaled in Russian media an intent to deploy Russian ground forces to when a ground incursion eventually starts. Whether that's a threat or something real, stands to be seen. But a lot really depends fundamentally on how the regime's strategy plays out and the effect that has on the armed opposition. And in that respect, one development that I just wanted to add in here in terms of discussing the opposition was the three main groups that Ibrahim described earlier. Jaish al-Islam, Falak ar-Rahman and Ahrar al-Sham sent a letter to the United Nations yesterday saying that they would be willing to basically turn their guns on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Nusra successor group, which has 200 to 300 fighters in East Ghouta, which is a very small number in comparison to these other groups. And so they said, we'll turn our guns on HTS, we'll force them out of East Ghouta in exchange for a number of conditions. One of them was the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2401 for a minimum of 2 weeks, a complete cessation of all bombing on East Ghouta, the cessation of targeting of emergency responders, the white helmets, etc., etc. I don't think we're going to see those kind of conditions being met, but it is interesting that the armed groups, the mainstream opposition armed groups in East Ghouta, are kind of using the very small presence of HTS as a negotiating tool,
as leverage,
as a sort of leverage.
Yeah.
And they're also revealing to the West in particular, who designate HTS as a terrorist organization but don't perceive these other groups as terrorist organizations, that this is kind of where we should be drawing the line. The majority of the armed opposition in Syria is quote-unquote legitimate and recognized one way or another by the international community because they've been invited to negotiations, they've participated in negotiations. And the minute presence of one designated terrorist organization shouldn't be used as a justification for indiscriminately targeting over 400,000 people. So it's just interesting that they're using that as leverage or as a negotiating tool. But that's not me saying that's going to work. But nevertheless, it's one additional dynamic.
Ibrahim, I mean, 2 weeks ago we were talking about the Northwest and Afrin and the Turkish incursion there and a lot of fighting going around in that area. While we've been focused on Eastern Ghouta and the horrific developments there and the inability really of the international community to do much about it, what's been happening up in the Northwest and how do you read that?
So there are two major events in the Northwest. One is the fighting between the armed opposition groups against Tahrir al-Sham in areas of Idlib, Hama, and Aleppo as well. And then the Turkish intervention against
the Syrian armed groups fighting Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the al-Qaeda affiliated
group.
They are receiving the groups that are fighting against the Al-Qaeda, they're receiving support from Turkey. Is that
most
accurate?
of them, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Most of them are well connected, and they receive a lot of support from Turkey. And just in the last few hours, they could push Hayat Tahrir al-Sham from many major towns in the suburbs of Hama, Idlib, and Aleppo. And also we have the Turkish intervention against the Kurds. They are increasing the number of checkpoints in those areas, and of course that's concerning, because all the areas we're talking about, either Ghouta or the Northwest, they are supposed to be part of the de-escalation agreements, which couldn't really continue. And now even the regional and international parties are escalating inside Syria. Whether we're talking about...
in Afrin, there was talks, in a sense, between the Kurdish group there, the YPG, and the Assad regime. And there were some Assad loyalist units that moved into the city, if I'm not mistaken. Has that become sort of the new situation, that Afrin city, between the Kurds and the Assad regime, is there sort of cooperation?
It's still not finalized yet. I think we're yet to see how things will turn inside Afrin. There were a small number of forces loyal to Assad that could reach the city. Other convoys were also hit by the Turks, trying to draw a red line and not allow the YPG to get connected to Assad's
So that hasn't
forces.
really taken
Not yet.
full
It's
shape
still
yet.
not yet. I think in the next or in the coming weeks we'll be able to tell more about Afrin and what kind of a deal the Russians, the Turks, the Kurds, and the regime will be able to reach.
Charles, we're running out of time, but I want to end with the U.S. position on all of this, or leverage or absence of leverage. The U.S. has 2,000 troops or personnel in the Northeast. The administration has spoken loudly about what's happening in eastern Ghouta. We saw the diplomacy play out and kind of fail in New York. But how do you see U.S. policy, U.S. leverage, or even the international community's leverage on particularly the horrific events in eastern Ghouta, but a bit more broadly in the Syrian war itself?
Well, I think we've all seen pretty clearly that the international community has chosen not to have a lot of leverage over these situations. Of course, on paper, we have perfectly have the means to exert leverage on this, but that means doing things that our governments don't want to do. So, in effect, what we've seen is a number of very tense, very terse statements from all of our respective governments, talking about how bad the situation is, how it is hell on earth. But in effect, all we've done is negotiate over the wording and structure of sentences in a UN Security Council resolution, and then hope that the actors on the ground who have never stood by and gone along with ceasefires will suddenly do so this time around. So that's kind of the reality that we've seen in terms of East Ghouta. More broadly, US strategy in Syria, I think, is under severe strain, actually. I think the Turkish intervention in Afrin has introduced some major contradictions in our policy. And it's also potentially revealing major contradictions between the White House and between the State Department and the DoD.
How so?
In the sense that the State Department and the DoD behind the scenes have been actually actively encouraging the SDF and the YPG, our main counter-ISIS ally, to start to negotiate kind of local arrangements and rapprochements with the regime, with the knowledge that the United States doesn't want to spend money to reconstruct, but the regime might be interested in doing so in the interests of power-sharing agreements. On the other hand, the White House, in its newly released Syria vision, I would say, rather than strategy, has positioned the United States in direct opposition to the regime and Iran. In effect, our Syria vision is an anti-Iran vision, and it's pivoted on the presence of our 2,000 troops in the existence of the SDF as our primary ally in the northeast of the country. Now, all of a sudden, Turkey has intervened in Afrin, and some of our guys in the SDF have traveled to the northwest of Syria to fight, against a NATO member, Turkey, whether we like them as an ally or not, they are a member of NATO, and they have brought, inevitably, weapons we've given them. Obviously, they're enjoying training that we've provided. Not only that, but they're now being joined, as Ibrahim regime says, in some number by pro-regime forces, and they appear to be being armed with Iranian weaponry. Very clearly, they've been driving Iranian armored vehicles and jeeps and using Iranian munitions. So as far as the Trump White House is concerned, that is ringing major alarm bells. Suddenly, our only ally on the ground is working with our committed enemy, Iran and the Assad regime. But in so doing, it's actually following through in some ways with what the State Department and the DoD originally wanted to happen. So there's confusion in Washington about what our Syria policy is and what our allies should be doing. And the whole White House vision for Syria, I would say, is in complete question right now. So complete confusion and ambiguity and contradiction in US policy. And all of the advantage, again, appears to be in the regime and Iran's hands more than anyone else's.
Thank you, Charles. I'm going to end, Brahim, with you and some of the voices you've been talking to in the last few days in eastern Ghouta. I mean, I'm sure they're desperate voices. I saw some activist, or I don't know if it was a medical doctor, he said, we've given up on appealing to human rights organizations. He said, could we appeal to animal rights organizations? What message can you send, that you still think would resonate? Is there any hope in the world doing anything to stop what's going on in eastern Ghouta?
It's absolutely disappointing to see that the whole world is just observing the most documented conflict in the history and is unable to do anything to help those civilians. The question of how to end violence and to protect civilians on the ground should be the main question, and the international community needs to think how to break the dynamics of the conflict inside Syria, which is just making it more complicated and violent by time.
Thank you, Ibrahim al-Assil, for being with us. Thank you, Charles Lister, and thank you to all our listeners for being with us today. If you would like to leave a comment or remark, you can go to our Facebook page. That's www.facebook.com/Middle East Institute. Thank you for being with us today, and we'll see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.